Okay, so let's look at the organization of the code. There's a preface which applies to all members, and then part one is the AICPA code goes ahead and tries to specifically address situations with different types of CPAs working in different types of situations. So part one will apply to members who are in public practice. And so, you're going to have integrity, objectivity, judgment, and some of the other, values that CPAs have that are going to be discussed in this particular part. But it's going to be, the rules are going to be more specifically geared to, CPAs who deal with certain things in public practice. Then part two will deal with people who are in industry, like for instance the tax department of a large company, and that, or for instance the accounting function or what have you. And then part three deals with people who are working in other than public practice or industry. And so that would typically encompass those who are in, for instance, government or working for the states or what have you. So, for instance, IRS agents who are CPAs would probably fall within part three. Retired CPAs or CPAs who work for nonprofit organizations, that would probably be in part three. And so there, I go ahead and show you the numbering format so that you can see how to identify the different AICPA codes. So when you see the term ET preceding a section number, that does signify that is the AICPA code of professional conduct. Okay, so that's kind of the precursor. So let's go ahead and take a look. Oops, sorry, went a little too far here. With the first item, which is of course integrity. Integrity requires a member to be, among other things, honest and candid within the constraints of client confidentiality. Service and the public trust should not be subordinated to personal gain and advantage. Integrity can accommodate the inadvertent error and honest difference of opinion, but it cannot accommodate deceit or subordination of principle. Okay, so again, as I said, that's the one thing I do like about this code of professional conduct, in that it kind of paints this picture of what we want a CPA to look like. And so it emphasizes that indeed CPAs really are public servants. And so as I teach ethics at a graduate level, sometimes I'll ask the students, questions like, well, why did you go into accounting? And some of my graduate students will say, well, because I'm good at it. Okay, well, and I think that's a fair statement. Very few people, as we know, are good in accounting. It's hard and difficult information, and it really takes, someone who has a lot of tenacity, because I don't think there's anything harder than going through intermediate accounting 1, and so the student says, well, I'm good at it. Okay, that's a valid point. Some students say, well, I went to accounting because, it's a good paying job. Well, that also is true. Some students say, well, it's because I'm introverted. Okay, well, I get that, because generally speaking, a lot of accountants are introverted people, and they're fine, being introverted. And so that may be a good place for him or her. But typically, the graduate students never say the words, I am going to accounting because I want to be a public servant. And so that's the point where I remind them that actually being a public servant is part and parcel to this job. And so our jobs are very unique in the sense that let's back up. Most of the time, our clients or employers want to report, want to engage in fair financial reporting. They actually want to follow the accounting rules or follow the tax rules, and that's typically the case. I mean, but on occasion, you're going to have an employer or a client who has a particular agenda, and unfortunately, it runs contrary to fair financial reporting. And therein lies kind of the dilemma for the CPA, because at the end, you're being paid your salary by this employer or by this client, but because you have a public duty that is more important than your relationship with the client or the employer, you may have to defy them, and that is really, really hard. Because your job is to uphold the accounting rules or the tax rules, even if it displeases your employer or your client. And it puts you in this kind of hard, awkward position because at that point, clearly you're basically falling on your sword for the public good. And in any case, it's going to put you at a minimum in an awkward position, and potentially could put you in a position where you may be losing your job or the client. And I realize that that's a hard situation. And on top of it, when you go ahead and you uphold the accounting rules in potentially contravention to your client's wishes, the public may not necessarily know that you have sacrificed for them. I hate to say this to you, but if you uphold the accounting rules and you get fired for it, there may not necessarily be a thank you note waiting for you in your mailbox. I mean, the public may not even know. But that is actually part of the job of the CPA, because let's face it, we're uniquely talented to carry out the type of work that we do. And if we don't uphold those particular rules, who's there to know right away that we have broken the rules, right? Who's there to know that we have, for instance, maybe shifted revenue from one period to another, or shifted expenses from one period to another right away? Well, no one may be able to catch up with us for some period of time, and in some cases forever. But if we don't do our jobs, what kind of happens to, for instance, the sanctity of these financial reports? At some point, if everyone starts to get a little squishy about the rules, then at some point, our capital system starts to falter, because people then at that point have a sense that they don't really know if these financial statements are true, and they don't know what they're buying or they're selling. Banks don't know whether they should lend to organizations or not if they feel that they can't 100% trust these financial statements. So at that point, things start to kind of crumble around the edges, and at some point they can completely fall apart. And that's the same thing with tax administration, because especially with the audit rates down, because we've all read stories in the news about how the IRS's funding has been cut and whatnot. Could you, for instance, reduce the amount of income that your client is reporting to the IRS and get caught? Well, your chances of getting caught, let's be frank, are probably not all that great, especially if you're not a large case audit. But if CPAs went ahead and did not uphold the tax administration in our voluntary tax reporting environment, then what starts to happen with our tax system? Well, again, that too starts to fall apart. And if we had kind of wholesale scofflaws who didn't go ahead and properly report their taxes, then things again start to fall apart in our society. I will say that the United States actually, for a country that has voluntary tax compliance, and I know we kind of put those in air quotes, but a voluntary tax compliance, we actually have a high level of compliance in this country as it pertains to gathering up tax revenue. And if we didn't, and if CPAs didn't really do their job to make sure that their clients paid the taxes that they owed, then of course we would pretty much fall apart, and we would be like a country like Greece, which is completely in a big mess, because they actually have very poor taxing system, and they don't have enough money to run their government, and things have completely fallen apart in that particular country. And so that's why our role as CPAs, as public servants, in fact, is really important, and it makes our profession quite unique, because we can't always act in our own best interest in this particular job. And there are a lot of jobs out there that don't have a public service requirement. But the role of the CPA clearly has this as a component. So I tell my students that if you don't want to sign up to being a public servant, then you need to find a different job, and there's plenty out there that you can go to. But this particular job requires us to have a high level of integrity, and it is completely based on good judgment. And it's a unique job in that if you show poor judgment in your personal life, that could necessarily impact whether or not you get to be a CPA, because central to our particular jobs is good judgment. And I tell the students, I hate to break this to you, but you're not being hired and being paid really good salaries for your knowledge of the accounting or tax rules. Of course, your knowledge of the accounting or tax rules is a prerequisite to being hired, but you're really being hired for your judgment and your objectivity. And if you're not able to do that, and you're not able to act in a way that serves the public good, then there's lots of jobs out there where you can be completely self-serving, right? Or in fact, you can show poor judgment in your personal life and still keep your job in those other professions. A joke that I always like to make is, Hollywood actors are notorious, and if you look at all the in some of those periodicals, that they do crazy things in their personal lives, and but yet that does not disqualify them from being a Hollywood actor. If they've made, for instance, mistakes in their past. For example, Robert Downey Jr. It's been well known that he ended up going to prison for 3 years because of drug use. But he got out of prison, he turned his life around, and it did not disqualify him from going back to Hollywood and taking acting roles. And in fact, a few years after he was out of prison, he ended up winning an Academy Award. And so, that's an example of a profession that you can make personal mistakes, but it doesn't disqualify you. Well, CPAs, it's a whole different matter, because there's been many times you've had good CPAs who have had a momentary lapse in judgment. In fact, an uncharacteristic lapse in judgment, but unfortunately that has prevented them from it's had long-term ramifications for them, and they lost their licenses, and they are no longer allowed to act as CPAs. So, CPAs really have a tightrope to walk, and you have to make sure that, your personal behavior does not involve and acts discreditable to the profession, and that you show good judgment in both your personal and professional lives. And for many of us, we wear that mantle easily. This is not a hard thing for us to do, but for others, it's a very difficult task. And so I just tell the students, just realize this is what you're signing up for, and you're going to wear that mantle easily, or you're not, and it's going to be a struggle if it doesn't if your personal life doesn't kind of track with what is expected for a CPA. So let's go ahead and look at the integrity and objectivity rules. So the AICPA code says, in the performance of any professional service, a member shall maintain objectivity and integrity, shall be free of conflicts of interest, and shall not knowingly misrepresent facts or subordinate his or her judgment to others. Now, I like to say that this one particular rule, this is basically the granddaddy of all the CPA rules, because about 80%, in my view, of our CPA behavior and all the rules stem from this particular rule, because it covers the most important values that a CPA has, which is integrity, objectivity, being free of conflicts of interest, and showing good judgment.